happened to the women of the Dark Ages? It's a simple question, yet one that echoes through the vast silence of medieval history books. When we imagine the Dark Ages, we conjure images of armored knights, blood-soaked battlefields, stern-faced kings, and chanting monks. But where are the women? What were they doing while empires crumbled and kingdoms rose? Were they only wives, mothers, victims, or were they something more? For centuries, the story of the medieval world has been told almost exclusively through the eyes of men. Written by monks, chronicled by soldiers, and sculpted into stone by kings, history became his story. In the process, countless female voices were erased, deliberately or carelessly, from the record. Their names forgotten, their knowledge dismissed, their power feared, but they were there. In every village, in every castle, behind monastery walls, and beside battlefield tents, women lived, endured, fought, and even ruled. They healed the sick with herbs passed down for generations. They mediated village conflicts. They raised armies and raised children, often at the same time. Some were literate and brilliant. Others were accused of sorcery simply for knowing too much. Many were punished just for surviving in a world that didn't know what to do with intelligent women. This video is about them. It's about peeling back the veil that time and patriarchy has drawn over the women of the Dark Ages. It's about confronting the uncomfortable truth that much of what we think we know about the medieval world is only half the story. Her story has been buried beneath fear, fire, and forgotten names, and it's time to bring it back into the light. We won't just be talking about queens and saints. We'll explore the lives of herbalists, midwives, outcasts, warriors, heretics, and nuns, women who lived on the margins of power and those who dared to seize it. And in doing so, we'll uncover how our modern understanding of gender, medicine, spirituality, and even evil itself has been shaped by how these women were remembered or deliberately forgotten. Because in the end, the Dark Ages weren't dark because of the people. They were dark because so many lights were snuffed out before they had a chance to shine. Many of those lights belonged to women. Let's find them. Before the crowns, before the cloisters, before the torches of accusation, there was dirt. The vast majority of women in the medieval world weren't noble, weren't saintly, and weren't feared witches. They were peasants, farmers' wives, shepherds, daughters, bakers, brewers, spinners of wool, mothers of 10, grave diggers for 3. And while kings argued over borders, these women bore the weight of a world that barely noticed they existed. Imagine her life, waking before dawn in a house of mud and timber, no wider than a modern bedroom. There's no glass in the windows, no chimney, no warmth except for the livestock sometimes brought inside to prevent freezing in winter. She rises not with luxury but with necessity, because water must be fetched, firewood must be chopped, and bread must be baked from last season's barley if the family is to eat. She is not idle. Her hands are always working, kneading dough, weaving cloth, digging turnips, soothing sick children, washing her husband's bloodied clothes from a scuffle with a tax collector. Her body is an instrument of survival, but society only calls it a womb. She might be pregnant 10, 12 times. Half of those children may not survive, and neither might she, but she isn't just surviving, she's sustaining. Peasant women kept entire households running while their husbands plowed fields or fought wars for lords they'd never meet. And beyond the house, they were often community healers, passing on practical knowledge of herbs, poultices, and seasonal rhythms. Midwives were rarely trained formally, yet they held life literally in their hands. They knew when a baby was turned the wrong way. They knew which roots eased fever and which leaves could slow bleeding. This wasn't magic. This was ancestral memory, learned woman to woman, unbroken across generations. And yet this knowledge made them dangerous. To the church, to the feudal lords, to the slowly centralizing powers of statehood, any knowledge outside male control was suspect. A woman who healed without the church's blessing might be called a sorceress. A midwife who failed to save a baby might be whispered about as cursed. A woman with too much wisdom, too much presence, too much independence became an anomaly. And in medieval Europe, anomalies didn't inspire curiosity. They inspired fear. The most tragic part, we rarely know their names. These women were illiterate, and even when they weren't, they were rarely allowed to document their lives. Their stories come to us in fragments, in trial records, in death registries, in sermons warning men to control their wives. Yet from those fragments emerges a profound truth. The medieval world wasn't sustained by kings or knights. It was upheld, quietly and relentlessly, by women like her. A woman with cracked hands, a tired back, and a fire inside her heart that the cold of poverty and the weight of oppression couldn't put out. She wasn't a witch, she wasn't a demon. She was the backbone of a forgotten world. She arrives quietly. No trumpet calls, no crowd, just the flicker of a lantern in the night and the trembling cry of a woman in labor. The midwife in the Dark Ages was both a savior and a suspect. She stepped into homes at the most intimate, vulnerable moment in a family's life, when a new soul struggled to enter the world and another might be lost in the process. There was no anesthesia, no sterile rooms, no hospitals, just instinct, experience, and a bag of herbs worn smooth with use. She knew when to turn a breech baby. She knew how to massage the belly to move contractions along. She knew how to boil water and how to swaddle the newborn tightly. She knew when to speak gently and when to command the room with the authority of someone who'd seen death too many times not to act fast. But there was a problem. She wasn't ordained by God, she wasn't trained by men. Her power came from other women, from experience, and worst of all, from nature. This made her deeply suspect in the eyes of the medieval church. You see, the church believed childbirth was punishment, a cursed consequence of Eve's original sin. In pain you shall bring forth children, said Genesis. So when a midwife used herbs to ease pain, or whispered prayers not found in the liturgy, or even dared to prevent pregnancy, some saw that not as mercy, but as rebellion. Worse still, midwives sometimes became accidental scientists. They began to understand menstruation, fertility cycles, and even rudimentary birth control. They passed this knowledge in whispers: chew parsley to delay bleeding. Avoid certain roots during the full moon. It wasn't magic, it was observation. Biology before biology had a name, but to many men in power it looked like witchcraft. And in a world where the line between healer and heretic was thinner than parchment, a midwife could be loved by mothers and feared by magistrates. All it took was a stillborn baby, one accusation, one jealous neighbor. And the woman who had delivered half the village might find herself bound and on trial, her hands that once cradled life now tied behind her back. They'd ask her, did you speak to demons? Did you tie knots to prevent conception? Did you curse this house? And sometimes she'd confess, not because she was guilty, but because torture was real. Because after hours of agony, anyone would admit to anything, even to flying through the night with Satan. Thus the healer became the hunted, the midwife became the monster, and the wisdom of centuries was burned along with her body at the stake. But her legacy didn't die. Her knowledge seeped into folk traditions, into whispered remedies passed from mother to daughter for generations. Though her name is forgotten, the shape of her hands still exists in every act of care, in every birth welcomed not with fear but with hope. She stood at the edge of life and death, and for a time she was our only light. In nearly every village across medieval Europe, there was one woman whom people visited in secret. They came at night or just before dawn, never in groups, never in public. Some brought coins, others brought eggs or bread. Most came with desperation in their eyes: a sick child, a loveless marriage, a missing cow, a rash that wouldn't heal. And they all asked the same thing: can you help me? The woman they sought wasn't a nun. She didn't wear robes or hold a title. She had no church behind her, but she had herbs dried and bundled with twine hanging from her thatched roof. She had powders and tinctures, roots soaked in oil, a little knife shaped like a crescent moon, and most of all, she had knowledge. Generations of it. She was the cunning woman, a term that once meant wise, not sly. Her wisdom came not from books, but from earth and pain. She knew which flower could calm a fever and which bark could stop bleeding. She knew how to read signs in the weather and how to brew something that might take the edge off grief or even fear. To the villagers, she was both a blessing and a last resort. No one wanted to admit they had seen her. But when the priest failed, when the noble doctor said there was nothing left to do, they came to her, and this terrified the church, because she represented a kind of power outside their system. She couldn't be excommunicated, she wasn't part of the church. She couldn't be controlled, her clients protected her in secret. She was medicine without scripture, healing without male permission, so her tools became suspect. Calendula for wounds, witchcraft, mugwort for dreams, heresy. Protective charm made from bones and string, pagan filth. They declared her potions poison, her hands unclean, her cures sinful, and yet the people still came. In times of famine, she showed them which roots were safe to eat. In plagues, she taught them how to burn herbs to purify the air. In despair, she offered hope that didn't need Latin or gold or trust. Some cunning women were burned. Others were simply erased, removed from memory, scrubbed from village records. Their craft, so vital for centuries, was rebranded as evil. Their tools destroyed, their homes abandoned, but not everything could be destroyed. The recipes endured. Passed in code, folded into lullabies, hidden in cookbooks. Even today, when we sip chamomile for sleep or rub salve on aching joints, we are touching the edge of her shadow. The cunning woman lived in defiance, not always of the church, but of a world that feared what it could not control. And through that quiet defiance, she left behind something stronger than spells, the legacy of female resilience. History rarely remembers the whispers behind the throne, but in the medieval world, when swords and crowns dominated the narrative, some of the most decisive moves were made not by kings, but by women whose names were omitted, softened, or twisted into myth. They weren't always official queens. Some were mothers, some were widows. Others were wives in marriages forged for alliance, not love, but each of them held something far more dangerous than a crown: influence. Take Empress Theophanu, for instance, an Eastern Roman noblewoman married off to Otto II, Holy Roman Emperor. After his death, she ruled as regent for her son Otto III, guiding the empire with a subtle strength that startled her male contemporaries. She was fluent in multiple languages, versed in diplomacy, and an expert in court rituals. She introduced Byzantine customs, architecture, and even spices to Western Europe. Yet most history books reduce her to a footnote, a foreign empress who held court while the real power slept in his cradle. Or consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose story could fill an entire epic. She was Duchess, Queen of France, then Queen of England. She accompanied her husband on the Second Crusade, defied royal expectations, and later led a rebellion against her own husband, King Henry II. She was imprisoned for nearly 16 years, yet upon her release, she returned not as a victim, but as Queen Regent, commanding alliances and securing the future for her sons, Richard the Lionheart and John. But these were the women we remember. For every Eleanor or Theophanu, there were countless noblewomen who governed estates while their husbands fought in distant wars. Women who negotiated peace between feuding lords, managed finances of entire manors, and acted as the glue that held fracturing kingdoms together. They used marriage contracts as chess pieces. They controlled land, advised bishops, and maneuvered through legal systems designed to suppress them. Their power was not in titles, but in persistence. Yet because their strength was subtle, woven into letters, silences, alliances, they were often deemed manipulative, treacherous, even unnatural. A powerful man was respected, a powerful woman suspected, still they endured. They shaped Europe from behind veils and scrolls, from within convents and courtrooms. And though the chroniclers rarely carved their stories into stone, their fingerprints are everywhere, in borders drawn, wars avoided, dynasties preserved. These were the queens without crowns, never coronated, often condemned, but impossible to erase. To most of the world, the nunnery was a prison, but to the women of the Dark Ages, it was sometimes the only path to freedom. At a time when a girl could be married off at 12, traded like land between noble houses, or sent to live under the thumb of her husband's family until death, some chose a different path. The cloistered walls of the convent, it wasn't just about religion, it was about agency. Within the monastery, women could read, write, compose music, study scripture. Some even engaged in philosophy and medicine. They could escape the dangers of childbirth, the constant threat of violence, and the humiliation of being treated as property. Most importantly, they could exist for themselves, not as daughters, not as wives, not as mothers. Just as women, look at Hildegard of Bingen, a visionary abbess, scientist, and composer in the 12th century. She wrote treatises on healing herbs and human biology that combined theology with natural science. She composed celestial chants still sung today. She corresponded with kings and popes, advising them on spiritual and political matters alike. No queen of her time had such intellectual reach. Or consider Ethelthryth, an Anglo-Saxon princess who became a nun after 2 arranged marriages, eventually founding the Ely Monastery. She was later venerated as a saint, not because of any battlefield conquest, but because she said no to royal obligations and yes to her inner calling. These women, cloaked in linen and cloistered in stone, were far from powerless. Many abbesses ruled their convents like miniature kingdoms, owning land, overseeing education, and even managing the defense of their abbey during times of war. They trained younger girls not just in piety, but in literacy and administration. But their autonomy came at a cost. Outside the convent walls, the world grew increasingly suspicious of women who chose the sacred over the domestic. A woman who wasn't under the thumb of a husband or father, that was dangerous. And so stories began to spread, of nuns possessed, of witches hiding behind the cross, of secret lovers and devilish rituals. The line between holy woman and heretic became terrifyingly thin. Still, for many, the risk was worth it, because in an age where most women were silenced, the convent gave them a voice. And some of the loudest echoes of that voice still survive, not in royal decrees, but in letters, hymns, and manuscripts carefully preserved behind monastery doors. Behind those walls, some of the brightest minds of the Middle Ages found sanctuary. And it is there, between the prayers and parchment, that we discover the quiet rebellion of women who refused to be erased. They knew how to ease a woman's labor pains with boiled herbs. They could stop a fever with a poultice of garlic and wild honey. They understood which plants healed and which ones could end a pregnancy in silence, and that made them dangerous. In the medieval world, the line between healer and heretic was paper-thin, especially if you were a woman. Many of the so-called witches burned in town squares were not dark sorceresses muttering curses under the moonlight. They were midwives. Herbalists, grandmothers who passed down generations of knowledge long before universities even opened their doors to men, let alone women. To the people, they were vital. They delivered babies when no physician would come. They eased death when no priest could. They whispered remedies in kitchens and field huts while male doctors still relied on leeches and bloodletting. But to the church and the growing medical elite, these women were an existential threat. Because knowledge in the hands of the wrong person was power, and power in the hands of a woman, especially one outside the rigid structures of monastery or marriage, was not just feared, it was hunted. By the 13th and 14th centuries, suspicion turned systematic. Texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, a witch-hunting manual written by Dominican inquisitors, began to frame female healers as agents of the devil. Their healing practices were unnatural, their confidence arrogant, their independence seductive. And thus, thousands of women were dragged from their homes, interrogated, tortured, and executed. What was once wisdom became witchcraft. What was once midwifery became menace. But here's the tragic twist. Much of their knowledge of plant medicine, fertility, sanitation, postpartum care was incredibly effective. And when these women were silenced, so was centuries of accumulated healing. The village midwife was not just a birth guide. She was often the only healthcare provider within miles. Her loss was a blow not only to women, but to entire communities. Yet even in fear, the stories of these women survived, in whispered folktales, in secret journals, in the medicinal margins of prayer books where someone, perhaps a daughter or apprentice, had scribbled recipes beside psalms. Today, we begin to recover their legacy. We name herbs again. We study traditional birth methods. We remember that behind every accusation of witchcraft was often a woman who simply knew too much and dared to use that knowledge for good. In the medieval world, a woman alone was a puzzle, sometimes pitied, often feared, but always watched. And no woman was more closely scrutinized than the widow. At first glance, one might think a widow held a rare power. She was no longer bound by the expectations of a husband. She could control property, sometimes even run a business. She had lived through the ritual of marriage and emerged on the other side wiser, quieter, and maybe freer. But that freedom came at a cost. The Dark Ages did not trust women who stood outside of male authority. A maiden could be shaped, a wife could be controlled, but a widow, a woman who had seen death and still held her head high. She became something else, something suspicious. They whispered about her, that she must have seduced her husband into his grave, that her barren bed now summoned demons, that her words carried the weight of witchcraft, because what else could explain a woman who needed no man? Widows became a convenient target for moral panic. They were accused of poisoning their husbands, of stealing inheritances, of turning young men astray. The church, especially in its growing obsession with purity and submission, looked upon them with cold eyes. After all, Eve had defied Adam. Would this woman defy God? Even literature turned on them. In medieval morality plays, widows were often portrayed as either dangerous seductresses or pitiful, dried husks. There was rarely any in-between, and yet, in the margins of society, widows found space. Some became innkeepers, others became patrons of churches, protectors of orphaned children, or leaders of female religious communities. They were survivors in every sense. In a time when childbirth was deadly, famine was common, and war never far, to outlive a husband was not always a luxury, it was a battle scar, and many wore it with quiet pride. In today's world, we forget how revolutionary it was for a woman to simply exist alone and refuse to vanish. To be a widow in the Dark Ages was to walk a thin line between reverence and fear. And yet their presence shaped entire towns, their coin kept markets alive, their prayers filled the churches, and their silence held stories too powerful for many men to name. Because behind every strong widow was a truth the medieval world could barely accept. She had lived without him and might just keep living. The convent, to some, it was a sanctuary, to others, it was a gilded cage. In the medieval imagination, nuns were often seen as the ideal women. They were obedient, silent, pure, cut off from the distractions of men, marriage, and motherhood. In a society obsessed with female chastity, the cloistered nun became a living symbol of holiness, one whose womb belonged not to man, but to God. But behind the monastery walls, the story was far more complicated. For many girls, becoming a nun was not a choice. It was a family decision, especially if the family was noble and had too many daughters to marry off. A dowry for the convent was cheaper than a dowry for a husband. In some cases, girls as young as 7 were sent to monasteries, not for spiritual devotion, but to preserve family wealth and political alliances. Inside the convent, the rules were strict, silence was sacred. The day was broken by prayer bells, not by personal desire. Meals were sparse, luxuries were rare, the walls were high, and the world outside became a memory. And yet many nuns found within those walls a strange kind of power. They became scholars, healers, writers, scribes, some even became abbesses, women who ruled over entire religious communities, who managed lands, led prayers, and counseled kings. In a world where women were barred from pulpits and politics, the convent gave some of them a voice, but that voice came at a steep price. To step into a convent was to give up marriage, children, autonomy, and often identity. Some fought back. Letters have survived from medieval nuns begging for release. Others smuggled out poetry filled with longing, not always for God, but for freedom, for touch, for the forgotten warmth of sunlight on bare skin. Some convents became places of rebellion, where women found secret ways to express themselves through art, embroidery, even hidden manuscripts. Others simply endured. They turned their prayers inward. They wrote hymns. They copied texts. They passed down herbal knowledge. They became the silent backbone of medieval literacy and learning. And while their names were rarely remembered, their work helped preserve the memory of a world that often erased them. So were they saints, perhaps? Were they prisoners? Also, yes, because in the Dark Ages, the line between devotion and confinement was razor thin. And for every woman who chose the cloister with joy, there were others who walked through its gates as daughters, and never walked out again. But even then, behind the cold stone walls, they left something behind, a quiet resistance, a sacred wisdom, and a whispered reminder that even when silenced, women still find ways to speak. It always began with a whisper. She cures the sick with herbs no one else understands. She speaks to animals. She reads the stars. She doesn't bleed like other women. She doesn't obey like other wives. In a world ruled by fear of plague, of famine, of divine punishment, mystery became danger. And women who lived outside the expected norms, especially those who wielded knowledge, autonomy, or influence, were often the first to burn. The fires didn't erupt suddenly. They simmered over centuries. In the early Middle Ages, the concept of the witch was still forming, but the seeds were there, fed by superstition, misunderstanding, and misogyny. The Church, in its mission to purge sin, became increasingly suspicious of unregulated spiritual practices, especially when they came from women. A midwife who saved lives during childbirth, suspicious. A widow who lived alone and owned land, threatening. A healer whose remedies worked better than prayer, dangerous. And so the accusations began. They were often absurd. She turned into a cat. She summoned storms. She danced with the devil. She caused a man's impotence or a child's fever. Proof, a birthmark, a black cat, a jar of herbs. Trials were grotesque performances of fear masquerading as justice. Women were stripped, shaved, examined for witches' marks. They were dunked in water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they drowned, they were innocent but dead. Some were tortured into confessions, naming other women just to end the pain. Some were promised mercy if they repented, and then burned anyway. But the most terrifying truth wasn't the fire. It was how the fire was framed. These burnings were presented as salvation for the soul of the accused and for the community. Executions were public. People brought their children. Bread was sold near the pyres. It became a kind of moral theater, teaching all women the same lesson. Stay in line, be small, be silent. Not all women accused were wise or good. But many were, and they were burned not because they were evil, but because they were exceptional. Too educated, too independent, too different. And in a world afraid of the unknown, difference was the ultimate threat. The flames were meant to erase them, but somehow their stories survived. Whispers turned to warnings, warnings became memories, and now memory becomes voice. Today we remember not the fire, but the fire starters. The women who lived fiercely, who challenged the silence, who dared to heal, speak, dream, and led. They were not witches, they were not demons, they were women, and they remind us that sometimes the real heresy is simply refusing to